will continue.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Which will continue in February at Port Louis. And these have included a number of sites, which I'll show you on a map in a second. So I am now, is that doing anything? Oh, right. Yes, I think it is.
Yes, we got it. Thank you, Rob.
Okay, does that look okay for everybody?
Yes, that's very clear.
Okay, great. Um, so the sites that we looked at up to 2023 largely consist of the early settlement sites, Port Louis, Port Egmont, but then have moved into the South American Missionary Society station on Keppel Island, and then a theme which has emerged in much of the later sites we've been looking at, which is looking at the Falkland Island Company sites and their slight predecessors at Second Corral, for instance. And those are geographically where the sites are that we've been looking at. We've also done a little bit on the Spring Point as well, looking for the remains of the Warra. And today I'm going to look at the various strands of evidence that we use as part of our archaeological surveys. So to give you an idea of what the methodology is and the sources of information that we try to integrate to get a detailed and a rich picture of the settlements and the sites that we're looking at. So we're aiming to create a detailed record of these key sites, and this includes a measured survey which maps the extent and the shape of earthworks, the banks, the ditches, the buildings, whether they're ruined or standing, and that is accompanied by a written description of the remains, observing the materials, construction type, accompanied by a detailed photographic record. Initially in the field work, when we started in the 90s, we were using traditional total station survey, and this is an old-fashioned now total station which records infrared points reflected off this little prism, which David Barker is holding very expertly there, and gives us highly accurate 2 millimeters over a kilometer accuracy, which is far more than we actually need. We're not building bridges. But it does allow us to record in great detail and with great accuracy and speed earthwork remains. But increasingly, new technology has taken over, and we are now starting to see, just to show you a couple of things, we're now starting to see new types of technology which enable us to map and record very accurately and very quickly. This is a drone picture of the corral at Darwin. And we also have the ability to create 3D photogrammetric models of structures and of landscapes. So here, for instance, this is the house at Tranquilidad, which is not a photograph. It's a composite. It's a still from a composite 3D model made up of hundreds of high resolution photographs taken from a drone. Much quicker than the traditional recording, and capturing texture, color, scale, and surroundings too, in a way that the traditional black and white paper 2D survey can't do. What we do with these data here are we integrate this archaeological record, mapping the sites, with the other sources, historical documents here in the Jane Cameron National Archive. You can see the letterbooks. I think those are FIC, but I'm not sure. Yeah, not sure. But anyway, historical records, historical maps on the top left. This is a pencil map drawn of Second Corral, showing in detail where the buildings are. This is Trinklidar from the ground, from our survey in 2008, I think. Sorry, 1999, in fact, there. And then here are some earthworks at Boca. very slight, but those are the sorts of archaeological evidence we integrate with the maps and the documents and the historical record. And then another dimension that we use, this is the material culture that David is a particular specialist in. The finds or artifacts, the objects that were lost or discarded on the surface in ash heaps on the shoreline. There's Port Louis, top left there, with bottles, 19th century, 18th, 19th century bottles on the beach. Some shoes, some 1880s transfer printed ware from the beach at Port Louis, and some Spanish, metropolitan Spanish tin glazed earthenware on the bottom right. So those give us together a rich idea of the activities that have been carried out in places, the economic connections, the trading connections, which is particularly important at a place where everything is important. And also these finds are very useful as evidence for dating. So combining these, then we end up with we can try to construct a detailed picture of the activities and the lives of people at these sites, their chronology and their function. This is one of the final drone pictures on the right, and then one of the final maps that we've drawn of Hope Place, where with our earthwork survey we've managed to plan or map the location of the buildings and the banks and ditches and corrals and so on. And the same information, well, it would have been the whole of Hope Place had the drone not fallen into Brenton Lock prematurely. And then one of the most detailed plans that we've drawn up combines a whole series of different earthwork surveys, and it also combines the contours. So you can see very clearly where the structures lie, the earthworks, the enclosures lie with respect to the topography of the landscape, which makes it very effective as a tool for presenting the layout and the way the missionary society people used the landscape that was available to them. So what we're going to look at today then is mostly Lafonia, but not quite all Lafonia. We will start in East Falkland first, and we'll be concentrating really on the early phase of cattle ranching that dominated those extensive grasslands in the early and mid 19th century. And the landscape of the Falklands, I don't need to tell any of you here that, has always been relatively sparsely populated and lacks both mineral resources and a climate and soil that can produce high-value crops such as sugar and tobacco. And as I work in the West Indies, the contrast is quite stark. It is, however, very rich in grassland, and the grassland was the key to economic development in the first half of the 19th century through the exploitation of cattle and later of sheep. And the herds of wild cattle that are technically feral rather than wild, that form the basis of the ranching economy, were introduced in 1764 with the first permanent settlement of the islands by the French aristocrat and circumnavigator of the globe, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville. And he attempted to secure the food supply in the islands when he took in, as he says, many horses and horned cattle, introducing livestock from Montevideo. So we can see there, this is the Pernetti view of Port Louis, and incidentally, a healthy looking little herd of cattle introduced by Bougainville. And the Spanish took over the French settlement. This is a very rapid history, you will appreciate, in order to get to the main point. The Spanish at Port Louis took over the French settlement in 1767, and their settlement and garrison were located on the same northeastern part of East Falkland in the area of Port Louis. And there you can see the Brambilla view of 1789 on the Malaspina expedition. And there again, lo and behold, in the foreground here and on the horizon there and over here, picturesquely dotting the landscape are the horned cattle that Bougainville had brought in, increasing, not by chance. The concept, though, of the estancias, or the outside farms, ranches, really, to exploit the growing herds of cattle, was developing by the 1780s by the Spanish. And Guillen and other maps show the Spanish at Port Louis had established a series of casas de las estancias para el ganado. And here is a map by Ramon Clerac in 1787. And there you can see two of those estancias, one here, and then the other one over here. This being Port Louis, and then huts and which were used for rounding up the herds over here too. But this is, sorry, north is at the bottom, just in case you were feeling a little bit confused. This is Port Salvador here. But Port Louis is still the focus of these ranching settlements, these estancias. And the numbers of cattle were still relatively small, at least the ones that they were counting. And annual reports from the governors in the 1780s start to record the number of cattle. There was a peak in the 1790s of over 3,000. But then by the early 19th century, when supplies from Montevideo were intermittent, there was much killing of the cattle. So they were down to a couple of hundred by 1806, shortly before the Spanish abandoned the settlement. And that shortage led to wholesale slaughter. So from a low base then, during the next period of abandonment, the cattle began to recover. And it was the early 19th century before Lafonia became the focus of attention for entrepreneurs again. And the first attempts to exploit the landscape of Lafonia, the southern peninsula of East Falkland, were made by Louis Vernet. He was born in Hamburg of a French Huguenot family, an entrepreneur, set up his own company in 1821 as a trading house and a cattle slaughtering enterprise. That was one of his main businesses. And through family connections, he learnt of the wild cattle on the Falkland Islands, saw the potential for large-scale ranching, and approached the Buenos Aires government for the right to slaughter them. In 1826, after a couple of unsuccessful attempts, Vernet re-established the settlement of Port Louis, which had been abandoned in 1811 by the Spanish. And by the end of the decade, he had established a network of estancias and reales, as he calls them, which appear to be more permanently occupied farms and then temporary stopping off points across a larger area of East Falkland. And here you can see that the cartography is of its era, but you can start to see estancia here, probably on Swan Inlet, one here, probably at Fitzroy. And then for the first time, Vernet is starting to move into Lafonia. And this, for those of you who aren't perhaps as familiar with the landscape, this is a peninsula known as Lafonia after two Liverpool-born brothers who will come into the story very shortly. And the cartography is somewhat inadequate in that Lafonia there is probably a third of its actual size. But the crucial thing is that there's a narrow neck here, the isthmus on which Darwin and then Goose Green were found later. That isthmus cuts off and allows easy cutting off of the territory to the south and the territory to the north, the rest of East Falkland. Vernet is starting, therefore, to exploit Lafonia. So his principal settlement was at Port Louis, but this map of 1829 is probably the most complete. And as I say, he established estancias and reales. He notes in English that we've already constructed corrals or pens for the cattle at night all over the island, and salting establishments for beef had been set up on the island. And this map shows no fewer than 23 reales, which are here, pens or corrals at stopping places. And we can see the the development, as I say, into Lafonia. And the two sites, there are two which appear to be a corral and some other structure of some sort, are called Rosas, after Juan Manuel Rosas, the Argentine political and military leader, who was the governor of Buenos Aires, interestingly, exactly this period from 1829 to 1852. I've looked on the satellite images, and it's very difficult to see anything here, but that area is quite built up, so it's difficult to know whether anything will survive of Verne's early attempts there. So after the British occupied the Falklands in 1833, for over a decade, the government at Port Louis largely maintained the herds for their own consumption at the settlement and for sale to passers-by ships that were passing. And it was the Lieutenant Governor Richard Clement Moody who took up the post in January 1842. In his long general report written only 3 months after he arrived, who identified the potential of the islands for economic development using the herds of feral cattle that were roaming extensively by that time around the islands. Although he was also a firm advocate of the value of sleep, well, and that as well, but also sheep, which turned out to be prophetic. In the end, the sheep went out, but initially it was the cattle that became the main mainstay of the industries that developed on the island. And it was the entrepreneurs, the merchant brothers, Samuel Fisher Lafone and Alexander Ross Lafone, both born in Liverpool with a business in Montevideo, who had a family background in tanning, who were notified of got to hear through relatives of the potential for ranching, cattle exploitation on the Falkland Islands. And it was towards the end of Moody's time in the Falklands as Lieutenant Governor that agreement was reached between initial government agreement between the Lafones and the British government in 1846. But there was a long-running dispute over the area of the Lafonia, and therefore over the estimate by area of the number of cattle that they could expect to find, that delayed that final settlement. But the establishment of the enterprise by the Lafones marked the continuation of the exploitation, or should I say really the beginning of serious exploitation of Lafonia after the first tentative steps by Verne. The island, this region was indeed, as I say, named after the brothers. And their representative, Richard Williams, had decided upon the site of their camp headquarters at Hope Place on Brenton Lock. And by early, there's Hope Place, and there is Brenton Lock, and somewhere in here is my drone. Early in 1847, construction was underway, and gauchos were imported from Montevideo. They built a saladero, or salting house, and set up prefabricated wooden buildings, and the ranchos were constructed for the gauchos in camp. But by 1849, the Lafones were in debt, having invested heavily but seen little return, and they put up, or they proposed the foundation of a company which would undertake the Falkland Island business, which then became Falkland Island Company in 1851 and purchased the Lafones' rights and interest, although they did retain an interest in the company. And after the long dispute was finally resolved, the Lafone brothers reached an agreement with the government, and that gave them the exclusive right over livestock in the islands, with certain exceptions, maintaining a breeding herd and maintaining supplies for the settlement, at Port Louis, so that were expected to produce as well. Numbers of cattle to show they just weren't going through slaughtering without securing the future of the herds. So at Hope Place, then, this was the first headquarters for the Lafonians, and there you can see the well, let's just look at the location of Hope Place first, because this is going to be important. Just to note that Stanley, which by this time had moved to its the capital had moved to Stanley, and Williams here makes an error which only becomes apparent during the course of the operation of Hope Place, and that is the distance from Hope Place by sea. Going all the way around, all the way around Lafonia, in a journey that was far longer than it would have been on the other side of the isthmus here at Darwin. And that is a repeated refrain of the camp managers. They must have despaired. Why did Williams put it here? But you can see Havers, I think it is, or I think it's Havers in 1855. No, 1858 it is, despaired that a boat, the Victoria, had taken 8 days to go from Darwin to Hope Place by sea, a distance of 14 kilometres. So this was a fundamental mistake in the positioning of their strategic position of the headquarters. So Williams arrived in 1847, and he from Montevideo with gauchos and their families, 117 in total, bringing horses, prefabricated buildings, and the tools needed to establish the settlement. And they built the site at the Hope Place, at the site chosen here by Williams. The wreck of the Robert Fulton, an American vessel wrecked on Lively Island in 1849, provided a useful injection of building material. And Hope Place became the headquarters for managing the company's livestock across the extensive grasslands of Lafonia. The management of the cattle was run from there. They were slaughtered there for hides, tallow, and meat. The camp manager, Richard Williams, lived there, and it provided accommodation for the gauchos and their families. They had created corrals and turf-walled enclosures for managing and slaughtering the cattle, and equipment was installed for processing their carcasses for transportation, and a salt house built for storing the hides. But the shortcomings of the location soon became evident. We can see here, I think let's have a look. We can see on this a contemporary map of Hope Place, which was found in 1999, I think. The site at Hope Place is surrounded by a ditch and a bank with the corrals there, and then you can see them more clearly on this drone photograph, but where the buildings, the stone-built or stone foundation buildings, are set out in relatively compact style here, next to the shore. And then over here, although not terribly visible at this angle, are the corrals, and a large earthwork bank surrounds the whole site. You can see that a little bit more clearly there. And then over at Rabbit Point here, there is a bank and ditch sealing off a headland, which enable them to enclose cattle in that headland during when they needed to count and sort the livestock. And again, another remarkable image here by William Dale, who was the camp manager between 1852 and 55, which I believe is in the possession of one of his ancestors or some of his ancestors. And I think Graham Pascoe in his Falkland saga shows those. But this is a very interesting view because it shows a number of buildings it shows their elevations. So you can see that one or two of the buildings are clearly dwellings with chimneys, with windows on an upper story. And there you can see the little attic roofs in the attic windows, rather, in the roof of a single-story, otherwise single-story building, looking very like some of the outside houses we'll look at in a moment. And then a large storehouse, probably. And here, this is the Galpon. But you can see from that image that that building appears to lack a roof. It doesn't look terribly finished. That's a gable end. And it's clear that this structure had not been finished. And this is one of the complaints of the later camp managers, that the buildings were at Hope Place. This is Havers in 1855, just a couple of years after Williams had gone. He was scathing. The buildings at Hope Place are scattered about over a great deal of ground without any regard to plan, convenience, or economy. They're rough and ill-built. Projects were abandoned. The water was inconveniently located, and the peat supply was in danger of running out. So, despite the investment of time and energy and effort in creating their headquarters at Hope Place, it became obvious that the long-term prospects for this site were not very good. And I'll just look at a couple more of the buildings first, but this is the detail of the settlement. And you can see the main enclosure there, which cuts off the sort of peninsula here, making it possible to manage the livestock in enclosures like this. The corral, the horse corral there for sorting and processing the livestock. This is the Galopon, which is an unfinished structure. And then buildings in here, which these are, I think, a store, and I think one of them is the house of the camp manager, which we'll look at in a moment. But here is where the hides, I suspect, were processed and salted. And you can see there the corral with its... One remarkable thing about the ground conditions in the Falklands is that where there is turf, you can still see the remains of post holes where posts have rotted, leaving a void, and the growth is so slow that those voids still remain visible. So you can see post impressions along the base, along the top of the bank of the corral, are remarkable. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to be able to see once you recognise it as an archaeologist, to see posts that have gone 170 years ago, still visible on the ground surface. This is the stone building. This is the Galpon that was never finished. And you can see at the back of this structure, this is our map of it, it has no proper back wall. It was never completed. And I think that shows in that view. And here there's a stone building, which is probably a store building. That was a building we could see on the same view, but with fewer windows. Store buildings don't need windows. They don't need chimneys because they don't need heating. And that is the case with this structure here. And there is another of the stone buildings. This is the collapsed gable wall of a very interesting building about which we know quite a bit, because the two end walls are in stone and the middle walls, which are defined by a sort of platform, they were clearly made of wood. And if only we'd had a picture of it. Oh, we do. There is the stone wall at the end. Stone wall here too, where the chimney runs up into the top of the gable, but the side walls are in some sort of clapboard. This is the manager's house by William Dale that he lived in at Hope Place, drawn round about 1855, and thanks to Jones Bridge for this and many others. And this is a self-portraited Dale who liked to dress up as a gaucho, but I suspect few gauchos had as many books as this, so this may be a gaucho in appearance, but this is William Dale with his Victorian washstand in the corner, lots of very English-looking accoutrements, but then also look at those knives. They look, and the bombija somewhere down by the, I can't remember where it was. Somewhere in the view. So there are elements of gaucho culture and elements of very British culture, which I think archaeologically make it very interesting if we ever excavate this. And that is the same building that William Dale was living in. So we have a fantastic pre-photo, well, it's not pre-photo photography, but it's around about the beginning of photography, and there are no photographs, but we have this wonderful watercolor. And then also at Hope Place, we can see other features, which are the corral. Those are the post cells I mentioned. And this is the bank, or the ditch that cuts off Rabbit Point. And there's the archaeological evidence very clearly defined as a marked ditch to exclude the cattle, keep the cattle enclosed. This is the period for the 1870s when wire fencing became common in the Falkland Islands. Boundary walls were constructed of turf walls, just like the Darwin turf walls, which I'll show you in a moment. But this was very labour intensive, far more so than the wire fencing. And so choosing these headlands where you could isolate cattle was the most effective way of doing that. So one of the features then of Hope Place was that by 1858, the decision was made to move the outside house, to move the headquarters. This was Lane, the new camp manager, and who thought, rightly so, that Darwin would be a far more suitable location, as it lay on the easy side of the isthmus, with access to the rest of East Falkland. And he sketched out in 1858 a plan of proposed buildings at Darwin, and the materials were very rapidly sent from Hope Place using the wood, leaving the stone behind. And he writes that he intends on the return of the Victoria to remove the materials himself. Hope Place is now officially dead, and Darwin has replaced it. But let's just look, before we go to Darwin, let's just look at a couple of other sites. And one of those is the network of outside houses, because this was I'll just whiz back very quickly to the, just to show you where those are. And you can see those, this is the Hope Place, the HQ, the new HQ at Darwin, and the outside houses are concentrated in northern Lafonia, with one here just across Brenton Lock in Cantera, and then a couple up here around in the general area of Port Louis, which the company also held. So these sites are very interesting, and also one of the highly visible remains of FIC activity in Lafonia. And they are a series of stone cottages, 2 stories, rectangular buildings made out of local stone. Here you can just see the outline of 2 windows upstairs, which tells us that there is a divided loft upstairs, which probably, given that's a 2-sided, double-fronted building, would have had 2 bedrooms on the other side as well. So 4 bedrooms upstairs lit by these windows. And the outside houses have a series of very consistent characteristics. Each of them stood on a prominent hill in what is in Lafonia a very undulating, featureless landscape. And they were chosen so they commanded their rincons, their quarters, and was visible from one another, particularly useful in this treeless and difficult terrain where landmarks are somewhat difficult to come across. So these are visible from many, many miles away. And each of them, as we can see here at Arcata, has a rectangular stone cottage as a dwelling house. They're bonded with clay, with roughly worked stones. They're not neatly worked ashlars. And the best preserved of these is at Cantera, which we'll look at in a moment. All of the houses have a large turfed wall corral beside a natural pond. And the enclosure in 3 cases today still retains the gorse, which was planted to reinforce the turf wall and provide shelter from the wind. And an essential element of this was pond for livestock watering, but also corrals for which are here at Tranquilidad, which are there for the horses, smaller corrals for horses, sometimes set against the larger livestock corral. And each of them also had, close to the house, a nearby source of peat and a cultivated garden for growing vegetables and fruit. Very consistent. There we have the garden at Tranquilidad, which I suspect has been maintained in use. There's still, I think there's still rhubarb growing in there when we looked in about 25 years ago. But you can see how it commands that landscape. It's visible from a very, very long way away. And there is the livestock enclosure, which we took a couple of years ago using the drone, which makes very much more sense of that feature. Abutting Paragon Pond up there for a livestock watering. And there is Tranquilidad, the outside house, still quite well preserved, although it burnt down in 1918 due to a bit of carelessness, apparently by Finlayson, the shepherd, who appears not to have noticed the chimney beginning to smoke and then set on fire, which is very unfortunate, but still remarkably well preserved. And there we have that 3D photogrammetric image. You can measure from these and plan. You could draw stone by stone drawing of this using this scaled model from the drone photographs, photogrammetry. And this is what these buildings look like, putting them side by side. This is new house at Lafonia, slightly later house, but you can see very, very similar in style and in dimensions. They're built to a model, basically. Go and build a house with 2 thick walls with these dimensions, and you have a front door and you have a series of windows drawn to a very English-looking pattern. There we have another Dale illustration of what the interior of one of these may have looked like, although we don't know which one it is. But it is a very intriguing image because many of these outside houses were populated or inhabited by gauchos from South America. So this is probably the kinds of furnishings that these buildings would have had in their heyday in the 1850s and 60s. But it's Cantera that is the best preserved. And this has been converted to a double-fronted house with a building with a wall, a room on either side, chimney on either side. So each side has a fireplace. And the interior is very interesting. You can see some of this is the gutter prop on the outside. You can see the details of that sort of stonework, woodwork, but you can also see the way in which this has been halved onto the wall plate. So it's the construction techniques would have been identical in all of these. And here we can see the upper loft with its doorway, the windows behind me, boarded over and often covered then with newspaper to keep out the draft. It's very interesting reading some of those early London Illustrated News, for instance. And here we can see some of the details of the tongue and grooved boards and some of these nice mouldings along the joists, the ceiling joists. So Cantera gives us an idea of what all of these buildings would originally have looked like. And they look very like buildings on Keppel Island too, built around about the same time. What else can we see archaeologically then at these sites? We've looked at the gardens very briefly. We've looked at the enclosures. They have corrals, but they also have ash heaps, and these are often very interesting rubbish dumps. Archaeologists love rubbish. Anything that's thrown away, archaeologists will seize upon. And just in this ash dump outside Tranquilidad House, there are fragments of pottery which help us to gain an idea of the material that they were using, the patterns of their tea services they were using in the house. Fascinating social history that David teases out so well. There's another example of an ash heap beside the main house at Darwin. You can see that's built up far more, in use for longer, but also has quite a lot of I'm surprised he's left those in, tantalizing fragments ceramics there that are his meat and drink. And then again, here at Tranquilidad, the main corral, shown on the ground, much less impressive on the ground than from the drone. And there's a typical corral at Cantera, just across Brenton Lock. Another site that was for, how long have I got, Graham? Sorry, oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yes, sorry about that, Rob. But yes, far be it from me to stop you. Please do carry on until you feel that you've told us all you need to tell us.
Well, I'll go for 10 minutes if that's
Yes,
all
that's
right.
fine. Absolutely.
Sounds a bit long. I'm sorry. Yes,
It's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Another site is the boca. And boca means mouth in Spanish. It's at the mouth of the end, the very end of Brenton Lock. And this was a special kind of outside house, which had a dairy. This is the dairy building. And I think I'm right in saying this building, well, I know it was burnt down in 1868, and it still appears on maps later. And I have a feeling that two para were going to shelter in this house when they were retaking Goose Green. But clearly nobody had checked the map since the 1860s to find out whether there's still anything there. I'm not sure if that's apocryphal, but it's certainly alarming. Must have been very disappointing. But here at the Boca, then, you can see this is a site that developed out of an outside house, basically, and into a more complicated structure, a series of structures. There you can see the cattle enclosure. There is Boca House itself. Boca House was removed to Darwin by Lane, so there's nothing left other than the earthworks that surrounded it. And then here we can start to see some of the buildings that are very ephemeral in nature. So some of the structures we're looking at when we're looking at some of these buildings, I mean, they all look very nice and clear on the maps, but some of them are very, very slight remains. And let's just have a look at some of those. This is that the dairy, 1868, it burnt down. There you can see a clear pattern. There is a drain. This is one of the reasons I think it's the dairy. There's a drain that runs from the building down towards the water. But there is a building which is likely to be the dairy, the calf shed, I think it is. And you can see there that in low light, these very slight foundations show up much more clearly. With the sun overhead or nearly overhead, it's very difficult to make any sense of these. But you can also see there the corral next door to that. So these are the archaeological remains of the structures, and there is the corral again in low light. But interesting things appear in these settlements. Gardens with cultivation ridges, which haven't been touched probably since the 1850s. Extraordinarily clear survivals, just as they do on Keppel Island. And here at the Boca, a platform of a building, a timber building's been removed, just leaving an impression underneath the house where it's killed off the vegetation and the ground has shrunk a little bit, but preserving the outside of the building. And also at Boca was what was originally called the Boca Wall, now Darwin Turf Wall. Once the settlement moved from Boca across the isthmus to Darwin, in 1858, the Boca Wall became the Darwin Turf Wall. Still the same thing, but you can see they're constructed out of turf blocks, peat blocks, 1.7 meters high, and I'm hoping to survey that this year. Have a more detailed look at that. Some of it was burnt, of course, in the conflict. But we have then Darwin, and the headquarters of the company moved across the isthmus to a far better location at the end of the 1850s. And this is a watercolor by Nelke in 1859, who is showing the Victoria, the FIC vessel, discharging its cargo. And there you can see the main house and various other structures. Also, of course, some picturesque cows, but you can also see the harbour, which meant that Darwin was a good anchorage, as well as located on the right side of the the isthmus. And that really gives the impression, the other side coming along here where the wool shed is located. And most of the buildings in the settlement at Darwin were concentrated in this area here. And this is one or two very early photographs, which make it very interesting looking at the looking at the structure, because almost all of these buildings have now vanished, and some of them are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to see. It's very difficult to go to Darwin. If you go for a cup of coffee at Darwin and you walk along over the grass, it's very hard to imagine or to envisage that this settlement was the second largest in the Falkland Islands in the second half of the 19th century. And there is a dense concentration, nucleation here of buildings. There's another one. I think this is 1888 as well. Superb photographs, which even allow you to work out what the building materials of the structures are. And you can see dwellings with their chimneys denoting hearths inside, and then other buildings. I'm not quite sure what this is. This is a meat shed or something. I'm sure somebody will put me right. And then the manager's house, which is the same one shown here by Nölke in 1859. And there again in more detail. And what I've done with these buildings is to identify, or try and identify, what they are from plans and from the photographs and from first principles of what the structures look like. This is being very obviously the church, but many of the others not quite so obvious. And then there is a key. Oh, well, it says church. And then camp manager, CM there. So this is 1888. So these are very early records, and they're great because they capture Darwin probably at its height. But you can see there, this is the archaeological survey that we did in 2008, trying to make sense of this, trying to tease out where many of these buildings are. But you can see that our survey has failed miserably to identify a lot of these structures, because for one very simple reason, that the way in which they were built was very, very ephemeral. They're built with timber frame structures, wooden clapboard, or sometimes corrugated iron, and they are very often resting on a series of bricks or a series of stones, which, if they're removed, you have very little clue where they are. But you can see here the corral built in 1870s, I think, garden of which has now shrunk because there are far fewer people living there. The doctor's surgery, the manager's house, cottages, which I think are part of the original structure. And we can see also the part of the jetty that originally ran across the little across the water here to the wool shed, which lay on the other side. And we're very lucky because, again, in 1914, the settlement was drawn. And the great thing is with a plan like this, that it tells you what the buildings are for. So rather than having to guess from what the appearance of them is and how they're built, what they're made of, you can see the attribution in 1914. There is one of them, the Galopin, built in 1894, 1895. The most, perhaps the oldest and most durable building in the settlement. And then next to it, the corral, built in 1874, but according to Tom Gilruth, which has a slight collapse in 2023, but was being repaired then. And then the smaller corral attached. But you can also see the platforms. The drone helps enormously with this, platforms of structures around that building. And again, this is a ground-based photograph, but the low light really gives us an idea of the relief and the detail of things like cultivation terraces in a disused part of the garden, which enable us really to see all of the kind of activities that were going on here in Darwin. And some of those buildings, this is the church built in the 1870s. I think it was brought over in 1872 as an iron church. It was a corrugated iron building. Those are the sole surviving remains of the church. Just a tiny little drop in the level. So it makes it some of these sites are very difficult to see because of that change in material type. So the stone-built houses at Oak Place have been replaced by far more ephemeral buildings that leave archaeologically, although they're more modern, leave archaeologically far less trace. So one of the things we've been doing as well at these settlements is we've also been working with the Pathfinders group, and this was 2008. I suspect these little children are now quite grown up. I hope none of them is watching. So what have you got me on there for? David is showing them, well, using his expertise to help to date the pottery that the children are finding along the shore. And here are some of those datable finds. And it is remarkable that within any settlement, by looking carefully, you can start to tease out clues. Some of them very interesting. Berto Cirios in Brazil. So the Weidmann factory must have been there, a brick-making factory, 19th century. And then the Four Press LBC, London Brick Company, which I think, again, is late 19th century. And then 1880s bamboo style ware. These were very popular in many of the Falkland Island houses in the late Victorian period. This is a very quick whiz. It's very superficial, but it gives you, I hope, a slight hint about indication of how we've gone about recording the sites. Some of the evidence that we can see, some of the evidence we know is there and can't see, and the way in which we've managed to integrate the history, the maps, the documents, and the archaeological evidence. And I just want to finish with a quotation which I discovered a few years ago. This is actually relates to Port Louis, so you may hear it again in 2 weeks' time. But this is the Swedish naturalist Carl Scottsberg, who lived at Port Louis for a short time in the winter of 1902. And Scottsberg, who was quite an erudite naturalist, it's quite clear the site at Port Louis, and for Port Louis, I would read all of these other sites too in the Falklands, these Falkland Island Company sites, exercised a powerful attraction as he recreated through his imagination the famous visitors and activities of the past. Port Louis is the classical ground of the Falklands, he says. Here lie the ruins of the old settlement. Here Charles Darwin strolled about. Here J.D. Hooker, the naturalist, collected materials for his famous Flora Antarctica. Here the Challenger was anchored. All these memories crowd upon the mind of a naturalist of today and cast a halo around the brown, desolate heath. And I think Scottsberg's quotation there really encapsulates for me the point of doing this, which is by examining in detail physical remains of these settlements and building up, integrating the information from other sources, we can cast a halo around the brown, desolate heath and sometimes green turf, but an awful lot of brown, desolate heath. Thank you. I've left no time for questions, so that's a shame.
Well, we have time. Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. And we do have time for some questions. So what I'd like everybody to do, certainly anybody who wishes to put a question to Rob, is look at the bottom left-hand side of your screen and unmute yourselves, put your microphones back on, and then raise a hand or just speak up if you like, if you want to ask Rob anything. Please go ahead. David.
Rob, thank you very much. That was fascinating. Can you tell me, when did corrugated iron come in as a roofing material?
It comes in the 1820s but it was largely used in Australia and California in the gold rush. So it became more popular than in England. And then in the 1840s and 50s, it became the sort of material that colonists in many places, South Africa, for instance, would use as a light, easily portable, easily assemblable type of construction material. It's also not very helpful for an archaeologist because it doesn't leave much trace once you take it away. So we don't like it.
And it rusts very easily, I would think. rust to
It does, yes. A lot of it was painted. I mean, it was galvanized, obviously, which helped. But then by painting, you could increase its life. But it's vulnerable to rust. Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you. And did they have masons in all these places? Because the stonework looks rather well done.
I think they must have done. Yeah, there are records of of masons who were constructing this material, and carpenters too, people who were capable of building these structures. The Hope Place Daybook, which was started in 1872, once Dale William Dale became the camp manager. That is a fascinating document because it does talk about the supply of the materials, and the implication is clearly that there are people capable of shaping the stone and the wood, but also then of constructing it into something useful. So I think if the documents would probably contain things like the professions, the occupations of the people working at the sites. There's so much one could do, I think, with looking at these as social history documents, looking at the Hope Place Daybook, looking at the populations, where they're coming from, looking at the kinds of material that were coming into the sites as well. It's absolutely fascinating. The guitar strings is one that Graham and I had a conversation about guitars earlier on. So that always appeals to me, that somebody in Hope Place requested some guitar strings and got them.
Brilliant. Rob, can I just ask you to unshare your screen, and then I can put you on Spotlight?
Right. Yes, indeed. Let's just. Oh, yes. Okay.
There we go. That's better. Great. And now I noticed somebody's name, Colin Young. Go ahead, Colin, and put your question, please.
Thanks very much. I was intrigued, incidentally, by your comment about Scotsberg, who wrote an absolutely fantastic report on the flora and flora of the Falklands when he was passing through. How he had time to do such a magnificent book, such a short period of time, I can't imagine. But what I was going to ask you about was you started off talking about Port Louis, and one of the photographs showed bits and pieces of broken bottles lying presumably on the beach somewhere.
Yes.
When I was there in the 1964, 65 or something like that, I had a free evening or two and borrowed a spade and went down to Angelina's bar to do some excavations.
Oh.
And I dug up several wine bottles, I believe they were.
Oh.
Brown ones, absolutely complete wine bottles.
Mm-hmm.
And I left them in the shelf in my office. Doubtless they were smashed by the Argentines, but I wondered if you'd come across, just by chance, any of them who may have reached its way to something like the museum. I didn't bring one home with me, unfortunately, otherwise I'd sent it down to the museum long ago.
What a shame.
Yeah, not in life.
Yes, this is one of the really interesting consequences of doing a talk, which is it stimulates all these little stories and anecdotes of people who found stuff. Let me show you that, Colin. Don't know if you can see, 4 complete bottles that were pulled out of or almost complete, out of Pig's Brook, as we call it, still at Port Louis by Pete Gilding when he was widening the brook. This stuff is around, and it's also, interestingly, for the bottles, they are quite closely datable because typologically they change quite rapidly. So you can date it 20, 30 years very often, sometimes more narrowly than that. Yeah,
How
interesting.
An intriguing comment. I noticed one of the photographs of the former garden at the Boca showed what I would recognise as lazy beds from the West Highlands of Scotland. They look just...
Oh, really?
Yeah, right. They look practically the same. A little bit less, more heaped up, but they were very common, and you used to come down and bring barrow loads of seaweed up and bury
right.
And I think it was partly to do with drainage, which rather puzzled me in the Falklands, because the last thing you need in the Falklands is drainage, because the rainfall is probably low. But I couldn't quite understand why they were needed there.
It's very interesting. Yeah, they used seaweed in Port Egmont in the 1770s, the British, in their gardens. The gardens were the glory of the colonies, as they said, and seaweed was one of them. And creating these lazy beds was another feature of their gardening technique. But it's very interesting because the Scottish Islanders were, of course, highly sought after at Darwin as responsible Presbyterians who would work hard, knew the culture, knew the landscape and the way in which to survive in a landscape like that. Good with the livestock, the sheep and the cattle. So so that makes very good sense to see that. That Scottish technique, in operation. I should change my label.
I might be wrong. You might be quite something different. Apropos of the Scottish connection, the mythology when I was there had it that back in the day they had a bit of an argument out at Darwin or Goose Green.
Oh, right.
And the police had to send out a Gaelic speaker so they could interpret because the guys only spoke Gaelic.
Really?
I think that one might be made up a bit. My final comment before I monopolise this too much was you showed a photograph of the old settlement and wondered about the building on stilts at the side of the water. I said that might have been the killing house because you just dropped the blood and refuse through the bottom. I don't know. That might.
Yes. Yes, I think you're right, actually. Yes, because the detritus, shall we call it, would drain straight away into the water. I think that makes very good sense. Thank you, Colin. Yeah, these insights are so interesting. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And Peter Wilson, I can see your raised hand, but I can't see everybody, so I think you're the only one with a hand raised at the moment. So go ahead, Peter.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob. But my comments are just related to the last comments as well. The lazy bed type of cultivation ridges are also very common in the west of Ireland.
Ah, right.
And again, large amounts of seaweed were used. In addition, calcareous beach sand.
Oh, right. Okay.
Because in the areas where they needed to grow crops, the soils being peaty were rather infertile.
Yes.
That would have been the case in the Falklands at some of these sites. So it would be interesting if those lazy beds could be excavated to see what they're actually composed of, whether it's sand, the calcareous component, the shell component would have decayed over time, so it wouldn't be there, but there may well be remains of the organic fraction of the seaweeds.
Yes,
So some understanding of the agricultural practice would be, possible.
Yes, that is a very, very interesting suggestion, and is the kind of suggestion that you could apply to the gardens at Keppel. There are analogous gardens with these ridges at Port Louis, Port Egmont, each of which would benefit from exactly the same treatment, taking samples. And because the organic decay is quite slow, it may be that there are remains of the seaweed actually incorporated into the soil.
Yes, I would imagine that there still is material there that relates to these, different species of seaweed that were used. Yeah.
Yes. What a fascinating idea. I think I've just got a Shackleton application there. I'll blame you. No, that's really interesting as a research project. Thank you, Peter, and as an insight too.
I noticed, Colin, you raised your hand again. Was that a slip of the finger, or would you like to say something else?
Not at all. It wasn't a slip of the finger. Apropos of the calcareous material, one of the geological FIDs who was passing through in the early 50s, or late 50s or 60s, a chap in Edie, he did some analysis of the shell sands deposits at Fitzroy, which the guys had been using to fertilize their gardens a bit. And if that is the only known deposit of any lime-bearing material in the Falklands, and it's probably all been dug up and used in the gardens now because it wasn't a very big deposit, but that's the only one I've ever heard of. The pHs, if you're an agriculturalist, the pHs of the soil in the Falklands are frighteningly low. I mean, you could never do anything about it. And that's why it's all this very low quality grazing grass for miles and miles. End of my comment.
Right.
Very interesting. Do we have any other hands raised, or would anybody just like to say something if I can't see you? Otherwise, I'll have a question of my own. Right. I was quite surprised, Rob, by the ineptitude of citing Hope Place where it was as a headquarters, as a base. I mean, that's the first thing, just when one thinks that a few miles to the east, and you would have cut out a couple of days sailing to Stanley, I would have thought. It's quite remarkable. And then you mentioned also the lack of peat supplies there. I mean, it's hard to imagine that it could have been quite so badly planned, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Both Havers and Lane were really scathing and Dale as well of choices made by Williams, and it's difficult to comprehend how he could put it on that side of the, knowing that was the sea journey was going to be increased by such an enormous amount by having to go all the way around Lafonia. It is bizarre. I don't know what he was thinking. I mean, he clearly was a man not on top of his game, I think we call it.
Perhaps it was difficult to find anybody to go and isolate themselves in the Falklands. But the other thing, just on a personal note, really, my recollection of Montevideo in connection with this is quite interesting because I went to school with a Lafone. So the Lafones must have stayed in Uruguay after their Falklands venture. I don't know what else they did. But a chap called Andy Lafone, actually, he was my brother's contemporary and friend, so he's a bit older. But quite coincidence or chance rather, I met him again in London. Andy Lafone had moved to London and didn't know an awful lot about his Falklands connection, but this would be of interest to you. He's now a jazz bass player, and so Lafone's with a connection to you in terms of your guitar interests as well. And
I like that. Well, the other connection is, of course, the Liverpool one, because the family was lived in a house. One of I think it was Alexander, lived in Thingwall Hall in Wirral, which I used to go past. I used to live just down the road from there. Sadly, long gone, but fascinating to see these connections.
Indeed, I don't know if the Lafones are still in Montevideo. I suspect they are, or maybe the name has died out. But the family still has connections. And finally, I was just going to ask you, what was the makeup, the sort of social makeup at Hope Place, and the approximate population at its height? And would we have seen families with children there, and therefore there would have been a need for education and so on?
Well, we certainly saw families with children. I have a breakdown here somewhere of the nationalities of one group who were brought in 1852. If you just give me 2 seconds. Later immigrants. These arrived in 1852. They included Germans, a Brazilian, 2 Basques, 3 Orientals, and 2 Chileans. So most of them were South American gauchos. And there was that obviously caused some disquiet with Moody, because while Moody was still there, because Moody was keen to encourage British settlers who would fit in and had the cultural awareness that was needed. So they were quite many of the names are Hispanic when you look at or Spanish when you look at the Hope Place Daybook, for instance. One of the sites was called Archaeologist, so you can see again that's named after a personal name of a Spanish speaker. So very interesting social composition, which then by the time that they were becoming established in Darwin, then there was that drive, that push to bring in the Scottish, which was clearly successful, given that they the church was founded by subscription from the Scottish Presbyterian congregation there, potential congregation. And your Gaelic speaking anecdote certainly is a fascinating one, isn't it? Not something you'd have anticipated necessarily.
Absolutely. Rob, we've been talking now, you've been talking really in an absolutely fascinating way and entertaining us and informing us for a little over an hour. So I think it's probably time to let you go. But I'd like to thank you. And if everybody could switch their microphones back on again, unmute in other words. I'm watching, yes, the little red lights are going out across the board here. So yes, I'd just like to propose, some applause really for Rob and
Well, that's very kind. It's very nice to see. Very nice to see names I recognise, names I don't recognise, new people. So thank you very much for coming and for your fascinating insights into the subject too.
Well, it's been very enjoyable, and we are going to see you again in just a few weeks' time. And I'm not sure who's getting some interesting sound effects there, but we're going to see you again in a few weeks' time, talking about. I wonder if that's an echo or something. Anyway, talking about your work at Port Louis, and I'm going to send out an email to everybody. Feel free to pass it on to your friends and relations as well, to alert you to the exact time of Rob's next talk. That will be about his work at Port Louis, and I'm looking forward to that personally very much. So again, thank you very much indeed, Rob. Thank you so much.
Thank you, one and all. See some of you in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah.
Excellent.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. And I'm just about to end our meeting. So we'll see you all again before very long, I hope. Bye-bye, everybody.
Right. Bye-bye. Bye.
Can't seem to end it.